But as in the early stages of the Etruscans, around what we would consider around 700, 600 BC, the Etruscans were doing, and there's another map that kind of give you an idea of how big an area the Etruscans had encompassed. And then the orange here, all of the Latin folks that spread out over time, and then the various people that were spread out. But the Etruscans became a very wealthy people over time. They discovered that there was a copper and there was different elements of metals that was in the regions of Etruria, or the Etruscans had found. And trade started becoming prominent in the region. So they became a very wealthy people, but they were very traditional people. And this map here kind of shows some of their early customs of what they did. They had this type of superstition about them. And what you're looking at is a necropolis. And a necropolis is just simply a site of tombs. It's all of the Etruscan tombs and where that they would bury their dead. And the Etruscans had a unique belief about the dead people. When someone would die, when they would pass away, they believed that they became a spirit, some type of deity. They were deified in a way. And when this loved one would die, they made sure that they would go to great lengths and extent to bury their dead. And a matter of fact, the tombs of the Etruscans would be equivalent to mansions. And what the Etruscans lived in was nothing more but mud huts. In the early stages, they were just mud huts. And as they develop, still yet they are only developed slightly, but they used mud walls for a long time. What we know as wattle and daub. They would take the thatch and they would put mud together and they would make mud bricks. And this is how they would build their homes and build their huts. But when it came to the dead, much like the Egyptians, you see the Egyptian pyramids, they had put great lengths in the burial of their dead. They made sure that there was something about the afterlife, something in their innate nature that told them there was something about the afterlife. And so all of this here is all Etruscan tombs, and the different colors just represent different time periods from the 7th century on to the 5th century BC. And some of the earlier tombs that the Etruscan had is in these big round domus, also known as tumulus. And in this is kind of a picture of this necropolis. This is an inset, but this is an aerial. And all of these trees that you see here, what you saw on that previous map, all of this outlay of these tombs is really what is all in this area, all of these tombs. But these tombs, if you would look at this inset, they were literally carved out of the rock. And the type of rock, it was a bedrock, but it was a soft bedrock. And they could carve the bedrock and tunnel in. And all of these are separate tombs. This is all rock that they had carved. And then they dug down the earth and made it look taller. And in a few cases, they later stacked some bricks in some later time periods on others. But all of this is bedrock. And they carved it like a big drum. And then they tore the dirt down, and then they would pile dirt up on top of it. This is one of those tombs, and how that they would circle the tomb like a drum. And all of this is bedrock. This was how that they dug down and carved in, and then later they put all of this dirt on top to make this tumulus for their tomb. Inside of these tombs that they had, we're going to look at this one here. They would build it for all of their family members. And later on, these were all later people would carve inside of this bedrock. But this one in particular was one of the early ones of the Etruscans. This is kind of a plan of that, as they would walk in. And to the very farthest part would be the part that they would lay their oldest, one of the head of the house. He had the elite status of the home, and they would bury him into the most inner chamber. And then from there, they would bury the youngers in succession on out. And when they went out of the room, they would just dig another tunnel. This is the inside of that. You can see how that they would carve the inside of this tomb and put a bench around the sides. Sometimes they would cremate their dead and put it in ash urns and put it along the side. This seat was often used for them to come and to set and to visit their dead. Not much different than what we think of in a mausoleum today, the above ground mausoleums that we use. This is another tomb that they had, and they started developing what was known as these terracotta acroteria. And these acroteria were emblematic. It was emblems of the people. They started designing them to actually, literally, represent their dead loved one that died. And this became the concept of ancestors. And their ancestors had some kind of connection to God, some kind of connection to heaven. And this is known as the Tomb of the Five Chairs. And there were 5 of these that were set on each one of these areas. And they had buried their dead here. And then each one of these terracotta represented their ancestors that would watch over them, watch over their dead, and also watch over them in life. This kind of custom, or this kind of ideal, begins to develop as they build their homes. All of the side, this is kind of a model, but all of the side would have been their mud brick homes. But then on top, as they learn how to use clay and make terracotta clay, and as they did in those terracotta figurines, they begin to roof it, and it would protect the home just a little bit longer. And as they begin to roof this, they develop what was known as antifixes along the edges. And these were like faces that were depicting some type of ancestor of theirs, someone that had passed in their family. And also in that development, if you notice, they have more acroteria or figurines that they put on top. Notice the one on the right. You'll see a winged, like a lion with a man's face. This is a Greek thing. Even early on, this is a 6th century emblem. These are 6th century times. And even at this point, Greeks are beginning to influence the Etruscans. But in the middle, this is known as one of their ancestors. And it's a figurine. He looks like he's got a cowboy hat on. Looks like Tex. We'll call him Tex. I have a closer picture. I don't think I put it on here. I did. This is him. Tex. Did you see this guy when you was in Texas, Bob? Oh, I thought for sure you'd see him. Amen. He's Texas. But this is early on, about 6th century, and if you notice, they kind of had the beard. And they placed this, as you've seen in the last slide, up on top of the roof. They also had miniatures of these made inside of their homes. If you've looked at any of the old Roman time periods, or maybe you've read about it or seen it, they would pray to their ancestors. They had these little emblems or little figurines that they called the ancestors, and they prayed the ancestors to watch over them. All of that developed from the Etruscans early on, because they believed that when one died, somehow they were deified. They didn't think that figurine itself was a god, but it represented the God or the spirit of the one that had died. And not only that, if you had all of these tribes and it was an unorganized group of people, there was no political structure at the time to symbolize that you were the rightful owner of your property, you put your granddaddy up on the roof so anybody comes along and they see Tex, they know this is the house of Tex and all of his descendants. They're not going to mess with you. Not only that, but when you have Tex up on the roof and you need to get a prayer to heaven, they would say, ask Granddad. He's already halfway there. He's up on the roof. You can ask him and he'll ask for us. But it was an ideal that these ancestors watched over them and they could pray to them, and then they would intervene for them to God. This was all developing in Italy during this time. And some of the other areas, if you looked on this pattern of this roof along this area. They put these terracotta plaques. They were just literally plaques, and they designed these plaques with high detail, especially those that were elite, like those that were setting at banquets, and literally others are standing and they're holding palm branches and fanning those. This was someone's home of importance, but this is kind of how their ideal of gods begin to develop, and we'll see this as we go along, and then we'll begin. I want to show you how that this Hellenization really began to affect. Not only is Greek established, and the Greek people and the Greece and the Philistines are taking that culture and moved into Israel in the early part of the Iron Age, and then we see the Phoenicians that have this culture because they've moved into Carthage, and they're connecting to the Greek ways of life, and the Etruscans here in northern Italy, even on their own, they're developing the ideal of ancestors and these figurines, and they're beginning to design these figurines, and then they start having Greek influence that's starting to influence how they make those. This begins to develop into their worship of gods, and we start seeing it because this is a reconstruction of one of their temples. This is the temple of Apollo. Apollo developed among some of these tribes as what they saw as one of their gods. Not only did they have their ancestor gods, but somewhere along the line they began to look toward a higher God, a God that was a little higher than their family members and a little greater. And so they developed this statue of Apollo. And again, they build this temple. And this temple is very unique. Along the walls, it's mud brick again. It's only mud brick. It's just wattle and daub. And then on the roof, they have the same type of tile roof like on their home. But if you would notice, along the tops of the roof, all of these figurines, just as they did in their homes, you see these little statues. These are all representative of their gods. And as the village is growing and the people are growing and they all have these ancestors, they start bringing all of these ancestral gods and they start combining them into their temple worship. They have Apollo that they worship, but then they start connecting all of their ancestral gods. This is the many gods. This is why we see in Greece and Athens and Paul, and this is much later time for Paul in the AD period, in the current era. But you can see where Paul was dealing with all of these ideals that had birthed many, many hundreds of years prior. And these things are really taking shape. But what was really unique was how that they would build their temples. Their temples had specific structure. They just wasn't built at random. But they really began to build them with a specific structure. And the way that they would build it, everything about it had some kind of significance, some kind of superstition to it, or some kind of belief to it. They would later, as the Greeks began to figure out that there were alignments and axes of the earth and how the horizons were, and with the planets and the planetary movement, they began to build these temples on these specific axes. They would make them face a certain way. They would build them in such a way that what we would call a porch, it was a pronos, where that they had all of these pillars or columns, and inside it was empty. And then on the back was what was known as a cella. And inside that cella was where that they would contain like what you would see in this Apollo god. And that Apollo god would be in the back. And the priest or the agura would come out on this podium and outside here standing upon this what we would call a porch, but a pronos. And because it's aligned with a certain axis, he would watch for omens in the sky. He would watch for which way the bird would fly. If the bird would fly a certain way, then it was a good sign. If the bird flew another way, it was a bad sign. It would give them ideals whether they should go to war or they should not go to war. They would build these structures in the ideal that the front was good. Steps were always on the front. There was never access to the back. The back was bad. They built it on the axis of planetary movement that believed the right was good and the front was good, but the left was bad and the back was bad. And this was the ideology that was really taking root among the Etruscans. And we'll watch this develop as time goes on.